of the world, was committed to a mental asylum.
A modern chess game needs such tension, supernatural tension, that a normal human being cannot stand it. Necessary to feel kind of aggression, hate or contempt to your opponent, just to be able to stand well, such intensive play.
The eccentricities, political manoeuvrings and off-the-board tactics of modern chess are often thought to have begun with Bobby Fischer. But in fact, he was only following a pattern that had been set 100 years before by another American, a man called Paul Morphy. In 1858, Morphy, then only 21 years old, crossed the Atlantic and astounded European chess circles. Without even seeing the boards, he could play 10 chess games at the same time. And when he could see the pieces, Morphy was unbeatable. He soundly defeated even Adolf Anderssen, until then the best player in the world. Poor Anderssen was reduced to laughing with admiration at the helplessness of the plight of his own pieces when they met Morphy's armies. After defeating Europe's best, Morphy never played serious chess again. Back home in New Orleans, he tried without success to establish himself as a lawyer. And then, in the last years of his life, he developed paranoid delusions, including a fear of barbers. In 1884, he died. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the chess players didn't regain their composure until Morphy was buried. So it was that in 1886, two Europeans met in the first official match for the World Championship. Johannes Zukertort, aristocrat, linguist, swordsman and braggart, lost to Wilhelm Steinitz. The new champion was a cantankerous character. He spent the last year of his life in a madhouse. Emanuel Lasker was the man who beat him. A philosopher, a mathematician, Lasker stayed on top for 27 years, until the arrival of Capablanca, a Cuban prodigy whose talent was understood only by astrologers of the time, if even by them. The age of Capablanca and Lasker marked the end of an era dominated by the West. A revolution was on its way, which would change the face of the game. When Lenin brought communism to old Russia, he promised sport, culture and education for the masses. Chess incorporated all three. The Soviet leaders attacked what they called the degrading of chess under the corrupt influence of the Western European bourgeois café. With a 5-year plan for chess, the game would be politicized and purified. There would be shock brigades of chess players to bring it to the masses. And the masses responded with great enthusiasm. In the Soviet Union, chess was becoming as popular as football. When Capablanca visited Moscow in 1935, he was astounded at the progress their chess had made. Both in numbers and strength, the Soviet Union was well on the way towards becoming the greatest chess-playing nation on Earth. In a simultaneous display, Capablanca won less than half his games, and by that time he'd already lost his world title. The main goal of Soviet chess was to defeat the man who'd replaced him. Since 1927, the world champion had been Alexander Alekhine, himself a Russian, but a good Tsarist who'd fled after the revolution. The Soviets described Alekhine as a fascist renegade, but in fact he had no interest in politics. Alekhine loved women, cats, alcohol, and above all, chess. The Dutchman Max Euwe won the title in 1935 from an Alekhine who seemed to be in a drunken haze, but Alekhine sobered up enough to regain the title 2 years later. And then in 1946, Alekhine died, and Mikhail Botvinnik won the tournament to find a new champion. The Soviet production line had started.
Mikhail Botvinnik was not yet world champion when he began training replacements. This is not surprising. He began exactly the same way at the School Children's Palace of Pioneers, and then came many tournaments and many victories. When Maestro Kmoch congratulated the young player on victory, he hardly thought that he was congratulating the future world champion. 15 years later, in the same hall, Grandmaster Euwe shook the hand of this new chess king. This was the last time a foreigner took part in this ceremony. Subsequently, Botvinnik congratulated Smyslov, and Smyslov congratulated Botvinnik. Then Botvinnik congratulated Tal. A year later, Tal again congratulated Botvinnik, who relinquished the crown to Tigran Petrosyan. Only recently, the young Soviet Grandmaster Boris Spassky stormed the chess heights. True, he was unsuccessful. Still, the chess crown remained in the Soviet Union.
In 1969, Spassky finally did manage to take the title from Petrosyan. He was the 5th consecutive Soviet world champion. Among them, they'd held the world title for nearly 20 years. But Boris Spassky became the first Russian to have to defend the Soviet chess empire against a real threat from outside. Bobby Fischer was a true chess prodigy. At the age of 14, he became United States champion. At 15, he was a grandmaster. When most children were still battling with their schoolwork, his battles were with champions like Mikhail Tal, the man whose fierce glare had caused one opponent to put on dark glasses for fear of being hypnotized. Even at this age, only Fischer's immaturity stood between him and a crack at the World Championship. The Danish Grandmaster Bent Larsen was his second at the Candidates Tournament in 1959.
Fischer was 16, and at the beginning of the tournament, Fischer had a cold, so you order from the chambermaid some boiling hot water, you drop 6 drops of this into it, and then you sit like this for 10 minutes. But Bobby didn't like that. That is waste of time. And I said to him, well, Bobby, you saw that was a good doctor, better do it. Yeah, it's a waste of time, and he didn't like it, and it didn't smell good, and I don't know what. But better do it, okay. But in order not to waste all this time, this precious time, completely, I should then read something loud from a book. Okay, which book? Bring the book. And then he sat there inhaling, and I read for him a story from the book which was called New Adventures of Tarzan. It was about Tarzan's first nightmare when he had eaten some rotten elephant meat, and I read this to the World Championship candidate, and that has remained in some way a special memory for me. New Adventures of Tarzan.
In Buenos Aires 12 years later, Fischer pushed his way one step nearer the top. A match against Petrosyan for the right to challenge Spassky for the world title. By now, Fischer already had the reputation for being difficult. More than once he'd walked out of tournaments or imposed impossible conditions. And he was difficult on the board too. Not even reading Tarzan stories saved Bent Larsen from being humiliated 6-0, and he was only one of the opponents Fischer left spiritually bruised. He only just beat Petrosian 6.5, 2.5, one more demonstration of his chess genius. Fischer was a scourge of Soviet players, both on the board and off it.
Yeah, well, the thing that I resent is, when I first started playing chess, to me the Russians were heroes. And they still are as chess players, and I used to study all their literature, and you know, most of the first books I read were Russian chess books. But the first time the Russians ever mentioned me, I remember I was 13, and they wrote about me. They said, there's this, talented young American player, and they showed this famous game I'd won against Donald Byrne. They called it the game of the century. Not the Russians, but the rest of the world. And they showed the game, but on top of the game they said, well, he's a very fine, talented young player, but all this publicity he's getting is sure to do damage to his character. And then sure enough, from then on, they started attacking my character. They prepared it then, and then they just started attacking my character. They never even met me or knew anything about me, So this, and then, this kind of attitude has really turned me off.
Off the board, Fischer was a perfect nuisance. On it, he was a perfect gentleman, as even the battered Soviets would have agreed. He'd taken on the USSR single-handed and seemed to be winning. Boris Spassky alone was left to defend Soviet honor against the Fischer onslaught.
They just feel that it's their game and they're not going to let anybody have their title. And they just believe in attacking me and using the players to, write nasty articles about me and rig games among themselves and this kind of thing. It's just pure propaganda, and it's just, and they don't believe in, they just believe that they have the title and the title belongs to them in perpetuity because it's theirs, and that's their attitude. And they don't have a kind of a sporting attitude. Their attitude should be, well, if he's the best, he should have the title, but that's not their attitude. They don't believe in giving foreigners a chance to play for the title.
Beating the Soviets became a total obsession, but Fischer was also a genuine eccentric. In one tournament, he'd even played his moves by telex, because the American government refused to let him go to Cuba in person. In all his battles, on and off the board, he was a true loner. Bobby Fischer trusted no one but himself.
Once more.
He lives alone, always in hotel rooms that seem barely larger than chessboards. The television set is his window on the world. Daytimes for his exercises, nighttimes for old movies. It is almost the only company he keeps. A lot of the time, he won't even answer his telephone. He's shy, suspicious of strangers. It took us nearly 6 months to persuade him to sit for this television portrait.
It took much more effort to drag Fischer to Reykjavik to meet Spassky. In fact, but for two things, the whole match might never have taken place. First, the English banker Jim Slater added £50,000 to the prize money, and then Henry Kissinger phoned him to appeal to Fischer's sense of patriotism.
Even this little thing with me and Spassky is sort of a microcosm of the whole world political situation. You always read about, they suggest the two world leaders should sort of fight it out hand to hand or something. This is kind of that kind of thing now we're doing, instead of, with bombs, having it out over the board.
Hardly had Fischer arrived in Iceland, then he began to complain about the playing hall, the chairs, even the colour of the squares on the chessboard. He lost the first game. He then complained about the cameras and refused to play while they were there. He lost the second game. By default,
I have good recollections about my match against Bobby. I like that we didn't have a direct fighting, direct conflict between us. That was indirect.
the new champion had always made it clear he was going to stay at the top.
I'd like to keep taking on all the top players to really prove that I am the best player in the world today.
So when they go home that night, they can't kid themselves that they're so hot.
However, between 1972 and 1975, when he had to defend his title, Fischer didn't play a single game in anger. And in 1974, the rows began. In the end, exasperated by the disputes with the organisers, Fischer resigned their title. From the genius of Bobby Fischer, who still considers himself to be the world chess champion, the last 14 years have produced just one curious pamphlet, an account of his bizarre arrest in 1981 on suspicion of a bank robbery. Meanwhile, a young man named Anatoly Karpov had silently risen to fill the void created by Fischer's absence from the world's chessboards. By comparison with the loud American, Karpov was bland, quiet, and diplomatic. In 1975, he found himself champion of the world. The crown had gone back to the Soviet Union by default. Karpov may have lacked the charisma of Fischer, but the effectiveness of his play is undeniable.
He's so thoroughly prepared. He's got an opening repertoire. He knows absolutely inside out. You know, it's almost impossible to get an advantage from the opening against him. Once he realizes what's going on in a position, he seems to grasp it completely, and he'd just churn out move after move very quickly. It's as though everything's completely sorted out in his head, and he doesn't have to work out anything at all. He just walks around and comes back and plays the moves. And fantastic speed of play, very frequently. Even when he has a tiny advantage, nothing really significant.
People don't like to study his character because, in my opinion, he is a very original character among the gallery of great chess players in chess history. Because his first appearance is a very modest. That he has a very thin voice, like. When, for example, when you speak with him, he said, "Okay, you can buy the stamps, animal sport. You can easily sell it." The first impression is very strange.
Without chess, I could not live, because if somebody sees a game of chess for the first time and recognize how beautiful it is, he really cannot live anymore without chess. One who has never seen a game of chess is, in my opinion, an unhappy person.
Not having played Fischer, Karpov had a good deal left to prove, but he had kept his appetite for battle and proceeded to win tournament after tournament. His collection of first prizes soon became larger than that of any other world champion in the history of the game. But his first opportunity for a world title match came in 1978. His challenger was Viktor Korchnoi, a Russian defector who harboured bitter resentment against the Soviet Union and the way they treated him the last time he'd played Karpov.
All the shots which are made by the Soviets, very artificial about the match, because I'm always thinking at the bottom. He's playing quickly, well, he's genius, I'm working hard. And the audience is worrying for him, the audience is greeting him, and they are shouting, "Smash him, well done, Tola, smash him, Tola." And I'm nobody.
With his wife and son still unable to leave the Soviet Union, Korchnoi had worries far beyond the chessboard. For the coming battle, he would need to be prepared mentally, physically, and emotionally.
His name is Karpov, of carp, fish. And he's cold like a fish. And his mind is very exact, precise, like, well, like a fish, you know. So he's not, well, he doesn't have a tendency to underestimate or even to overestimate.
Or to be
Yes, this is his best chess quality. He's not creative in chess. He's not creative in openings or endings. He is exact, like a good pupil, that's all.
Viktor Korchnoi met Anatoly Karpov in the Philippines resort of Baguio City. The climate of tension made those Reykjavik eccentricities pale into insignificance. There was a row over an allegedly coded yogurt pot. There were hypnotists and parapsychologists in the crowd. And to help Korchnoi, people came off the streets to meditate in the hall. There was even a guru named Didi who helped Korchnoi to concentrate. She helped him recover from an apparently hopeless position in the match. But finally, Karpov scraped home, shaken but still champion. For Korchnoi and his team, it meant going back to the drawing board to prepare a new challenge.
For the match against Karpov, we're going to take all his games, they're all published, and analyse them, dissect them, find his strengths, his weaknesses. And we have to go through all the games he's ever played, maybe a few thousand games. And then when it comes up to the match, there's a German analysis to be done, because the players can only play for a certain amount of time. Victor's able to go to sleep while we drink the black coffee, and the next morning we present him with our analysis, which we've been up all night, working away at the position, comparing ideas, trying to find new ideas, trying to find tricks, trying to find traps, or traps that we might fall into. And we write them all down, if we can remember them, give them to Victor in the morning over breakfast, and then he does a sort of demolition job, whereby he tries to break down all our analysis, or refute it, or find holes in it, or find something we've missed. The job of creating a constructive analysis is reduced to one of actually trying to destroy analysis which we have created.
And it wasn't only on the chessboard that Korchnoi's seconds sometimes found it hard to keep up with him.
I'm jogging, I'm swimming, I play table tennis, I'm skiing, and at the eve of the match, I stopped smoking and, and using alcoholic beverages as well. So I behave now myself like an angel, and I hope it will help.
But Korchnoi's second challenge in Merano in Italy in 1981 was not a success. He could return to enjoying alcoholic beverages, but the dream of the World Championship seemed destined to elude him forever. Anatoly Karpov was now secure at the top of world chess. Perhaps in this particular simultaneous display, he wasn't thinking, like Botvinnik, of training replacements. As a long-term strategy, it might be better to discourage such precocious talents as that of 11-year-old Nigel Short, for instance. But one particular talent would not be discouraged. The latest Soviet chess genius was Garry Kasparov, 10 years younger than Karpov and apparently unstoppable. A series of crushing victories had taken him to the top. The last win against ex-champion Smyslov gave him the right to meet Karpov. Moscow, the end of 1984, and the champion and the young pretender met. At the start of the match, Kasparov was all energy, aggression and optimism. He'd crushed everybody else. Why should Karpov be different? But the first 9 games were disastrous for the challenger. Karpov managed 4 wins and 5 draws.
I didn't imagine what is this, the World Championship match, because I won very easily all strongest grandmasters in the world, Beliatsky, Koshner, Smyslov, and won some tournaments. And I was sure that I could beat Karpov too, because to my opinion, 2 years ago, there was no difference between the World Championship match against Karpov and the Challenger match against Koshner, for example. But there was great difference, and Karpov has shown me very, 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 very soon.
Karpov even increased his lead to 5-0, but that sixth victory to give him the title wouldn't come. As draw followed draw, the match stretched into its sixth tedious month. Kasparov fought back to narrow the gap to 5-3, and then, amazingly, World Chess Federation President Florencio Campomanes flew in and changed the rules.
I therefore declare that the match is ended without decision.
But that was only Act 1. Up till then, challenger Garry Kasparov had sat silent, and Karpov, the champion, hadn't even appeared. The president cited physical and mental exhaustion on everyone as the reason for ending the match. But he looked well enough, and so did Kasparov. And then came Act 2. Enter Karpov with cliché. Rumours of his death, he said, were totally exaggerated. He insisted he wanted to play. What about Kasparov? Kasparov was busy losing his temper. What a performance, he shouted. I could even win, but they're just trying to delay. The floundering president began to sink.
Now, however, I am in a very happy position right now.
But it didn't look like it, not for him and not for the Russians either. They just stage-managed their most chaotic press conference in years. The president called for a 10-minute interval. The 10-minute break has already turned into half an hour as the various sides try to work out an acceptable version for the public. That isn't proving easy. Back they came 90 minutes later. The decision stayed. Karpov accepted. Kasparov acquiesced with bad grace. The match would resume from 0 in September. It ended this performance, but the show itself seemed certain to run on.
And run on it did. When the match was replayed 6 months later in 1985, Kasparov won a nail-biting last game to end Karpov's 10-year reign as world champion. A year later in London, he successfully fought off Karpov's challenge in the return match. The youngest champion in the history of the game may know that he is the best in the world. But now it's his turn to suffer the anguish of waiting to be knocked off his throne into dignified retirement or the tormented world of so many champions before him.